All right, welcome everybody. Thanks for that introduction, Nicole. Yes, so my name is Tom Kowal. I'm a project director here at A Flight, and I wanted to talk to you all about effective remote collaboration. And it's a topic that's apart from just being a conversation in that delivery leadership group that we have internally, it's something that's very relevant to us as we start working with more international teams. It was particularly relevant for me as I was part of a kind of a bigger multinational organization here recently. And so a lot of interesting takeaways, interesting new challenges and opportunities that come along with that. So to set the context for this, right, in 2020, the pandemic forced a lot of companies to shift to remote. And while that started like that, it's still stuck around, and it doesn't seem to be going away anytime soon. As of September of last year, something like 45% of full-time employees in the US worked remotely at least part of the time. And that number is even higher for employees in white-collar professions, around 67%. And the desire for a flexible working arrangement is actually one of the top 3 reasons that employees sought a new job in the last couple of years. So there's definitely a lot of interest in that kind of a hybrid model. We've proven that it can be successful, and it introduces a lot of flexibility and just saves people time on commutes, and also expands the talent pool for organizations, right? They're no longer constrained to hiring individuals that are in the same city as their offices. And so we're seeing, multinational organizations are nothing new, but it is becoming easier to form multinational teams within those organizations. In part thanks to technology that's just bringing us closer together and making it easier to collaborate across those distances. So a perfect example of that would be the team I had the chance to work with here recently. I was with a company servicing the Middle East and North Africa region. And we had people on the team from Sydney, Australia, Cape Town, South Africa, Dubai, London, Las Vegas, Chicago, Indianapolis, just spread out all over. And honestly, if anything, like just pausing and kind of celebrating the fact that I got to connect with so many people from such diverse backgrounds and from all over the world and come together and build something, that on its own just kind of is something that I really appreciate and would love for everyone to get to experience. It was a really great project. But if we look at the time zones, it's pretty clear that a lot of overlap just doesn't exist. If we look at folks who are ending their day in Dubai and people who are starting their day in Chicago, for example, right? There's literally no overlap between our standard working hours there. And not to even mention folks in Sydney, Australia, who were well past their bedtime probably. And so it was tricky. There was definitely issues, and we quickly realized we can't default to real-time communication, which is I think something that I personally tend to do. I was definitely the one in the open offices, coming and tapping people on shoulders, whether you like that or not. I would grab you and go whiteboard and talk through a problem. And I definitely still appreciate that kind of face-to-face interaction and that collaborative problem solving. So it's something that I have to consciously be aware of, and something that I have to make sure that I'm considering as my teams are more spread out and have other work-life balance considerations. And that's a good thing, honestly, because there are a ton of downsides to real-time collaboration. And these aren't unique to the remote setting. They're not new. So if we look at the first one, right, each of us is at our best at different times during the day. This has been the case forever. And it just so happens that when we worked in an office in person, the fact is that people who prefer to work in the evening or overnight, honestly, we're just at a disadvantage. And even within, a standard working day, I might prefer to batch my meetings in the second half of the day and focus on delivery and coding in the morning. And other folks might prefer to start the day with some some more social conversations and meetings, and then go heads down for the rest of the day. And so trying to schedule something for everyone just means we're not going to be able to optimize for ourselves and for our best times of the day. You have folks who are, the more outspoken individuals tend to dominate the conversation, and that's not necessarily because they have, the most value to contribute. There are a whole host of reasons why the rest of the team might not be participating. From just anxiety in group settings to potentially needing a bit more time than others to come to a decision. As the next bullet point suggests here, right? Some of us go about problem solving a little bit differently. And we're trying to be conscious of listening to our teammates as they're kind of presenting their side of the idea, while also trying to make sense of what we're talking about. And let's be honest, we don't always do a great job of sending out context or agenda ahead of time, and so a lot of us are already starting the call kind of behind on the subject and trying to get to a point where we can contribute to the conversation. And these meetings, they're not happening in a vacuum, right? There's context switching involved. Some folks are coming from other meetings. Some folks are, interrupting delivery work that they were in the middle of. And so there's some residual kind of attention at either end of the meeting that also kind of eats into that real valuable part of the discussion. Documentation is not a given. It's something that we have to be deliberate and diligent about, capturing the conversations, the questions, the decisions that were made. Oftentimes, we're trying to summarize while also listening, and so we're skipping over things. We're losing a lot of nuance, and who knows in the end how valuable some of that stuff is. So, meetings can be especially tricky for multilingual teams as well. Our teammates might struggle to follow along because we talk too quickly. We're using unfamiliar idioms. We speak with unfamiliar accents and dialects. A whole host of hardware issues. Our microphones might not be the best. Our internet connection is spotty. All things that, even as a native English speaker, right, can cause us to struggle to keep up with the conversation, let alone folks for whom English might be a second language. And we often put the burden on the other people in our team to kind of stop and ask us to repeat ourselves or to clarify something. And there's this implied sense of urgency in the conversations when we have an hour to discuss something, or less than that. And nobody really wants to be the person to slow the team down or to ask us to repeat ourselves, maybe more than once. And so what happens is, you end up just kind of building a gap between the people who are kind of aligned and understand what we're talking about and folks who are maybe a little bit behind and trying to catch up. And the more that continues, the further we get apart, and the more people tend to kind of sit quietly and hope that they can get caught up before the next conversation begins. And then there's scheduling. We haven't even considered scheduling, right? The bigger the group, the more time zones. This is an example of just 3 people in one time zone. Granted, it's clearly these aren't folks who are on the maker's schedule. They don't have a whole lot of focused time where they're heads down. There's a lot of kind of short meetings throughout the day, but the fact is, we're collaborating with stakeholders and leadership at our clients, and this might be their reality. And if we start factoring in, standard working hours and people spread out around the globe, it becomes very tricky, if not impossible, to get all of the right people on the call at the same time. And so I want to start by just kind of running through a couple hypothetical problems, maybe some contrived examples a little bit here, but I'm curious, how true these might sound to folks on the call. But let's look at a day in the life of the office. Pam needs to work with her team to solve a problem, right? So Pam schedules a call with Michael, Dwight, Meredith, Phyllis, and Oscar. Michael is the first to drop out because he has a scheduling conflict, so he can't make the call. For Oscar, that's 6 a.m. his time, and he's not a morning person, so he's not going to make the meeting. And Phyllis happens to be out on PTO that day. So we're now down to half the group. They meet, discuss the problem, come up with a proposal, go their separate ways. And then later that day, Michael pings Pam, right, interrupting her where she might be now switched into her focused, deep work part of the day. And so she has to come back and kind of catch Michael up on the conversation. So they hop on a quick call, as we often do, and talk about the conversation that they had earlier, the proposal. She mentions Phyllis and Oscar weren't available. So Michael, trying to do his best, he reaches out to Phyllis and Oscar and asks them to sync up with the rest of the team. Oscar once again interrupts Pam. Now she has to explain to Oscar the same decision and the same conversation, answer new questions. Phyllis eventually reaches out to Pam and Dwight, and turns out she had some critical information that the group didn't take into account. And so they're back at square one. Pam needs to work with her team to solve a problem. Pam schedules another call. And I mean, there's a whole host of things that could be improved here that don't necessarily mean we have to go lean towards kind of an async communication mode of communication. But there are things like taking notes, potentially not having to involve such a big group in the decision in the first place. There's a whole host of things that we can consider. But I wanted to look specifically at the idea of how do we do this less synchronously? How do we reach for tools that aren't necessarily jumping on a Zoom? And so some of the observations, right, we have not everyone was able to make the call for various reasons. Folks were out on PTO, they had scheduling conflicts, it was outside their working hours. There was no documentation of the conversation. So anyone who's missed the meeting is already behind for any future conversations. There's a high coordination overhead, right? Pam has to constantly interrupt her day to talk to the rest of the team. Michael is trying to make sure that everyone that needs to be looped in is looped in. There's a lot of context switching, and there's fewer opportunities for that deep work and the ability to just go heads down on the interesting and more meaningful work. And in the end, the group was missing context. They couldn't make a good decision. The conversation was rushed. Oftentimes, we're trying to make a decision so quickly that we're not really stopping to consider whether we're giving ourselves the space and the time for ideas to really just kind of linger for a little bit, and for us to evaluate them, think about some of the sides of it that we might not be considering. And so let's take a look at what that might look like in a more asynchronous flow. And I'm going to include in this, a few tools that I've come across as I was researching and reading blogs from companies that have kind of made this switch to a more deep work focused style of collaborating. This is not necessarily an endorsement of any or all of those tools. I haven't necessarily used all of those tools, so don't get caught up necessarily in the tooling. They're just examples and maybe prompts for something that you can look at later to learn more about that. But we start with the same problem, right? Pam needs to solve a problem with her team. This time, she creates a page in Notion or Confluence or a markdown file committed to some repository. Where this is, not really that important, but she captures the problem in writing. She captures the constraints. She's able to include relevant references and kind of piece together her own thoughts on the issue. And honestly, the act of putting this in writing in and of itself is allowing Pam to think through this problem at a deeper level. In conversation, it's easy to kind of gloss over some of the gaps in our understanding. We might pepper in like a "you know what I mean" or something along those lines to just kind of gloss over an area that maybe is a little bit thorny, or that we don't know much about, and we don't want to necessarily expose our ignorance in that area. And so when you're kind of forced to put your thoughts in writing, you're really kind of requiring yourself to consider the problem at a deeper level. And so already we're getting more valuable input into the conversation. So Notion, Confluence, Markdown files, those can kind of be the outputs of the artifacts that kind of capture some of the decisions or some of the the relevant information. But then there's a lot of noise as well, just communicating with the team. And so this is where Pam starts a thread in something like Twist, which is a just brief note here. Twist is kind of a Slack alternative made by a company called Doist. And their kind of philosophy with this is, creating a space where there are threaded conversations, so you're not having this constant, noise from different conversations being intermixed and losing sight of what was going on there. It's also encourages folks to be, have that heads down offline time and to come back to the problem. So if you're interested, take a look at this. It seems like an interesting idea. I haven't had the chance to use this with a team, but at any rate, at this point, I think I'm going off on a tangent here, so I'm going to keep going. And at this point, Pam, is able to go offline, and she's able to focus on her work for the day. There's no more of these necessary interruptions to catch people up who maybe missed a meeting, or to explain the proposal to another teammate. Michael sees the thread, but he decides, this is not the right time for me to think about this. I have other stuff that I'm in a different context. I'm thinking about a different problem. I want to finish that. And so already we're seeing the value of just decoupling those conversations, right? Michael can make a decision as to when is the best time for him to dig into this. Could be in the afternoon. And so that's what he does. Dwight, on the other hand, he's in the middle of a task, but he wants a break. So he's going to carve out maybe a longer bit of time, maybe an hour and a half to 2 hours, if he really wants to dig into this problem, look into other resources. He's not feeling that pressure of, we're on a call, this is an hour-long conversation, I have to get all of my thoughts in here. I'm competing with maybe other people's input, and I want to make sure that what I have to say is heard. And so he's able to kind of devote as much or as little time as possible to this, or as much as he needs. And then Pam, at the end of her day, right, she checks back in, sees updates, she answers some questions, updates the thread with an action item for Oscar. Oscar, having the flexibility of remote work and async collaboration, he's choosing to run errands throughout the day. He's going to sign on in the late afternoon, maybe put in some work in the evening. And so he catches up on the conversation. There's something about the action item that's unclear, so he responds to Pam and focuses on his other work in the meantime. So this is also touching on the fact that, like, we are going to get blocked at times and not be able to make progress. There's definitely a bit of lag introduced into the async communication, right? We're not going to be necessarily walking away with answers immediately, but we can talk about whether that's truly an issue. Here, another tool that I kind of came across in my research that seems interesting is this Yak. It's a tool for essentially doing screen sharing with narration. It includes automatic transcription, so you can post that to the Twist thread, and any kind of screen sharing you do, any kind of narration is then searchable and discoverable. And again, the tool here is not the point. You can use anything that lets you record and capture your audio. Transcription is a nice bonus here, but really it doesn't have to be a big investment to make this shift. And so the observations for me here are interruptions and context switching are minimal, and not only are they minimal, you're able to kind of make a decision as to when you are in a good place to interrupt your day, when to context switch. Conversations are inherently documented and searchable as part of the process. It's not something we have to do as an afterthought, or that we have to think about. It's just happening as part of the conversation. Everyone is included regardless of location or schedule, right? In that synchronous example, Oscar, for whom the meeting was happening at 6 a.m., he may have really wanted to be a part of that conversation. Maybe he had a lot to contribute, but just couldn't make it because of when it was scheduled. This kind of goes away with this new flexibility. Everyone is able to devote as much or as little time as they need to make sound decisions. The team can work during the hours they are most effective. And so in the end here, right, we have this bullet point of, yes, it's slower, but there's a question mark because maybe it's slower in the short term, but how much faster are we going if we're able to have everyone devote as much time as they need to kind of make these decisions? They're able to think things through. They're not necessarily interrupting their day. Like, there's a whole number of ways that this might be actually making the team more effective and more efficient, that just isn't necessarily visible from, I guess, at first glance. And the reality is, it's going to be some hybrid version of that, right? Where I'm not suggesting we go entirely async or entirely, the other direction. It's going to be some mix of these tools. And if we look at Doist, once again, it's the company that's behind Twist. They have a lot of great content on their blog. So if you're interested in this subject, I'll have a few kind of references at the end, but they're definitely one of the companies that talks a lot about how their team works. And they have this really great kind of visualization of the spectrum of tools that they use, ranging from completely async to completely synchronous, and they kind of call out the use cases for each of those. And so that's kind of one of the keys to success, right? Is setting clear expectations with your team. How do we decide which mode of communication we're going to reach for? How do I decide whether I should and can, interrupt somebody's day, and versus scheduling something, or versus doing, relying on these new tools that are more asynchronous. And we're not trying to optimize away all real-time interactions, right? It's important for team building, especially in a remote setting where we don't get to have all those kind of micro interactions throughout the day and get to know each other outside of just the problems we're solving. It's actually something very important about collaborating with remote teams and with international teams is making time for that team building and being deliberate about that. It really goes a long way to get to know each other, and then feel a little bit more comfortable with one another as we're getting to some of the trickier problems that we have to solve. What response times can we commit to for asynchronous messages, right? Part of this process is, a trust that your teammates are going to take time to respond and to provide feedback and to participate in conversations. It's very easy for the team to kind of fall into this trap of, someone else is going to respond to this. I'm going to focus on this other thing. I think we see that most often with pull requests where maybe they go on kind of waiting for a while because there's not this explicit kind of understanding of we're all going to take time out of our day to commit to contribute to that. What's the escalation process, right? If things are moving slower, or if we're not getting the kind of decisions that we need, how do we escalate? And what are we using these different tools for? Where does the documentation live, right? And here I'm not necessarily talking about software documentation, but more historical conversations, decisions, context. How do I know where I can find, and how do I catch up effectively on some of the conversations that I may have missed? And consider everyone, right? We want to make sure that we are sharing the burden of working across time zones. So something small that we can do, for example, is alternating the meeting time so that no one individual or group is always required to start early or end late to accommodate the others. We're at a greater risk of that when we have maybe one kind of core team, or the majority of our folks are in one time zone, and then we have kind of small teams spread out across the world. We have to make sure that we're not favoring the majority here and making those smaller teams feel like the outliers. Include the team's time zones. It's just, when you're proposing an event or talking about it, it's a small thing, but it really goes a long way in helping everyone feel like they are valued and part of the team, and they're not oh yeah, and these people need to be there, right? Like they're not tacked on to your team. They are a core part of it. And there are tools that we can use to automate this, things like Time Zone Butler for Slack, which will automatically kind of follow up with a translation of the time zone of the time in your specific time zone. Be conscious of how work is assigned. So, kind of going back to the idea of, okay, we have maybe the majority of folks in one time zone and then some smaller groups in another country. It might be that we subconsciously assign some of the more important, maybe the more challenging, the more risky work to the team that is closest to us, to our leadership team. And we're doing it because it's just easier for us to stay on track and aware of what's happening. But we're clearly then prioritizing one team over the other, and really we want everyone to be working on satisfying and interesting work. And take time to learn about current events that may be affecting your teammates' well-being and or availability. For us, an example on that team was a lot of our teammates were observing the month of Ramadan and being aware of just their decreased hours and other ways that they were impacted. Really helped us kind of plan our days in a way that we didn't lose a lot of momentum. We didn't lose, productivity. We gave them the space that they needed during that month, and we were just supportive teammates and helpful, and learned a lot about kind of working with an international team in that way. And then work to minimize artificial blockers, right? So build trust with your teams and avoid requiring PR approvals from a chosen few, for example. One of the important parts of this is that when I'm online, if I'm working in the evening, for example, and other folks are offline, I want to make sure that I can commit my changes to the code base, and I want to be able to keep moving, quickly without necessarily having to stop and kind of put a pin in things until someone is online or someone is available. We want to minimize the number of handoffs so that we're, getting things into production and everyone is really empowered to do that, right? There's obviously a change management process that needs to be followed, but building those kinds of safety mechanisms and that kind of trust to enable everyone to push to production. And again, kind of leaning on automation here, right? To minimize handoffs. So automating our test suites, including our regression test suites and our QA test suites and our deployments, really just enabling everyone to, at the push of a button, test their changes and feel comfortable merging them into the code base. And finally, keep enough in the backlog. So we saw an example in that example earlier. We saw a time where Oscar was blocked, maybe waiting on some clarification from Pam, but was able to keep going because there was enough well-defined work in the backlog that he could just reach for the next thing and keep going. And that's important to kind of create that fluidity and making sure that everyone is able to stay productive and they don't feel like their day was wasted because they got blocked on one specific issue and couldn't move forward. And like I mentioned earlier, right, there's going to be times where there's just no getting around meetings. Some conversations just need to be had in person, whether that's one-on-ones or brainstorming issues or debugging production incidents, retrospectives, things like that just have to happen or are best done together. So what we can do there is just continue to practice good meeting etiquette. Try to share an agenda ahead of time so that folks can come prepared and they're not at a disadvantage when the conversation starts. They can take the time that they need to put their thoughts together. And then when we're all there, we can focus on sharing that information. And document topics that were discussed and decisions that were made. Consider maybe a transcription service of some sort so that your team can focus on the conversation rather than taking notes and trying to summarize. It definitely gets tricky, as people are moving quickly, and you kind of just lose a lot in that transcription. And finally, just be conscious of the time, right? A meeting running long for someone who is already staying late is especially frustrating. You know, a meeting that goes over 20 minutes during your day is one thing, but if you're already, you know, into your kind of evening time, evening hours, any kind of an extra delay is just especially frustrating. And so this is kind of the end of my presentation here. I wanted to share a few companies that I found particularly helpful in thinking about these. So Doist, Zapier, Basecamp, and Buffer are all fully remote companies, and they do a lot of writing about this subject. They have a lot of tool suggestions and ideas and stuff to look into. So definitely follow up there if you're looking for some more kind of real world experience and some ideas to consider there. But that's the end of my presentation. Thank you all for joining, and I'm